Hey folks, good morning or evening, afternoon, whenever you choose to watch this. Hope you're doing well. Welcome to another series, installment, whatever you want to call it, of Common Sense Live. My name is MT Omni. I'm joined today by Basiah Twins. How you doing, Basiah?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
All good, all good.
Good,
Very,
good.
very excited at the prospect of freedom. The fact that we're a few weeks
Mm.
away from Boris Johnson's all-important 21st of June. It fills me with hope, with excitement.
You consider it weeks? It's at least a whole, almost 2 months.
It is, but in my head, we are just weeks away from the 21st of June.
Woo.
And I really am looking forward to things opening back up. Folks, if you're joining us live, thank you for giving up your time. Please do share this stream with somebody. The hashtag online is Common Sense Live. If you tweet, I promise I'll engage with your tweet. I might even read it out. And of course, you can comment as well. Let us know what you think about the topic, about the discussions, about what's going on. Basiah, what's the one thing that's happened this week that you think hasn't got enough coverage in the news?
What's enough coverage? Maybe just the COVID deaths in India. I know there's been news, but I think the severity of it, I don't see the panic, especially because of a country that has gone through our own turmoil. We should really be covering it, but then there's always a case of why you're covering it when we still haven't, figured things out here yet. But it just seems like the numbers there are just insane. Like I couldn't even imagine what it's like to be dumping bodies all around everywhere, So I think that's
Yeah,
something that
I've heard and I've read reported in some news sites that some people are actually burning bodies in their garden. That's how kind of terrible and dire it is over there. It's interesting because we only heard about India because our Prime Minister Boris Johnson planned a trip there.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we only focused on India because of the economic possibility of post-Brexit striking up a trade deal. But we didn't really get a sense of the humanitarian issue. I mean, the same thing happened in St. Vincent and Kitts, I believe, where we had, was it that where we had the hurricane? Sorry, we had the volcano.
Okay, no.
And the UK literally sent over something like £200,000. And that was it. When the place said that the damage is in the tune of about 3-4 billion. So it's just interesting to see how we consider these countries solely through the prism of economics.
And it's weird because they're both Commonwealth or ex-colonies. So you'd think again, what do you benefit from even calling yourself Commonwealth? Why don't you just call yourself ex-colonial places and call it a day? But I think the interesting thing about India again is the case of like recently, about 2 months ago, a month ago, we've been discussing there could be a shortage, right, of vaccines coming because of what's happening in India. And there was a whole complaint about India, doing like national fascism and not trying to share COVID vaccines with the UK. Then you look at it like, well, they have a bigger fish to fry at home. And it gives you a question of actually, where should they be focusing their attentions? And then, as you said about economics, but population comes back into it again.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why we never really spoke about India or any other, I guess, quote unquote, third world country is because the narrative was that they were coping better than the UK was. And now I think we're getting one of the most honest examples of actually how it is ripping through the global south. And unfortunately, maybe other countries are soon to follow.
Yeah. I mean, you speak about kind of Indian deaths and stuff like that. Of course, there was a death here in the UK. I'm going to pass to you to tell the story as we head into the kind of breaking news section of Jimmy the hero. So over to you.
Yes, as many of you might know, on Saturday there were reports that a 20-year-old young man, his full name is Folajimi Olubumi Adewale, but his friends and family call him Jimmy, had jumped into the River Thames to rescue a woman who had allegedly fell off the London Bridge. He had entered the water around midnight, and apparently there was another man there in an attempt to rescue her. Both the woman and the other man were rescued by the Coast Guard and Met Police unit, but unfortunately Jimmy was not found, and I think they had searches looking for him for about an hour until they said that they couldn't find him. And I believe his body showed up was it the next day or later on the next day? And I think the parents were saying that, or the father was saying that search for 1 hour wasn't long enough, and for an issue like that there should have been more searches. So first of all, obviously this is really sad. It's a young man who's lost his life, and not just lost his life in this way, but to save another person. And if that isn't heroism or martyrdom in I don't know what is. And I think it's just a testament that there are a lot of people out there willing to sacrifice their life to save people, and unfortunately, you know, he wasn't able to be saved. And I think there's a lot of questions now around how was it investigated, or how was his search, you know, and was 1 hour enough? And I've also read that there's calls by his family to get him, you know, recognized for his efforts, because I think there's a history of people doing things or called heroes, and they get recognized, you know, posthumously. So I think that's what the petition, there's a petition going around asking for that, which I would gladly sign, actually, because I think it is such an incredible thing to do.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on it?
yeah, absolutely. I think I share the same sentiments. It's very, very sad. You know, I know people closely who knew him, and so even trying to console them this week has been pretty tough. Ultimately, you know, anyone dying is always difficult, but to see a young man essentially give up his life for somebody else, I
Exactly.
mean, it speaks strength and echoes about his character.
Mm.
And you know, on the point about whether the police searched for long enough, you know, it is a bit sad that action by the police and action by authorities seems to be falling into this kind of pattern that, you know, the more cynical person
Negligence.
could look at and say that this is kind of negligence.
Mm-hmm.
And when you add the race complex to it, you kind of go, well, would this happen if it was the other way around? You know, if it was the
Mm-hmm.
white woman who dived in, as it
Mm-hmm.
were. But I, for one, I think there's room for that debate. It's not a debate I've been involved in personally, because I don't think I can
Yeah,
contribute meaningfully to it. But it is interesting to say the least.
definitely.
And definitely, you know, we wish his family well. I believe there was a
Exactly.
GoFundMe effort that saw them raise over £100,000, which I think hopefully can't go any way to, you know, to
Bringing it back.
making the family feel better or bring them back, but hopefully it will make things better for them moving forward.
Exactly.
The next story I want to talk about is actually about, obviously, Boris Johnson.
Mm.
Monday the 26th of April, we saw lots of different reports. Essentially, now that Dominic Cummings has essentially left politics, I think he's decided I need to ruin the government. So, one, he has a government Twitter account, or he has a Twitter account, I should say, which is
Yeah.
already kind of odd because with, you know, normally the price you pay for serving so high up in government, especially in an advisory role, is
Mm.
you at least don't tweet. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, Dominic Cummings is tweeting. On top of that, he has a blog that he's putting out different statements on what happened whilst he was in government.
Mm.
And the newest statement is, apparently, according to unnamed sources, the Daily Mail say that, and it's been echoed by lots of other independent kind of outlets, they say that the PM, that's the Prime Minister, said in a private meeting, that he would rather see bodies pile high in their thousands than order a third national lockdown. Of course, Downing Street does deny the PM said these statements, calling the reports total rubbish. But it's interesting, though, because some people are saying this is not believable. The Prime Minister would never say that. But of course, this is a Prime Minister that we know can be
Mm.
more than colorful with his language. Are you shocked by this, Messiah? Do you think he said this?
I mean, similar to many people, it's one of those debates you don't really want to get involved in, because I wasn't there, I wasn't privy to it. However, this is something about a character case, and as you said, it doesn't look like it's something that is beneath him. It looks like something he would say or could say, for many different reasons, and most of them are very insidious. But I think the issue is that we need to pay attention to the fact that, again, you've got powerful people kind of playing monopoly with our lives, and even the idea of leaking this information. What is it to do? What is it to do for us? Are you leaking it to say, hold on, this government is incompetent and therefore you want to hold them to account and transform our governance? Or are you just saying it so you can put us in another space of just confusion and fear? You know, so I feel like we have to be careful about these things. Might be true, and I'm not doubting it isn't, but then what is the aim? And again, these kind of publications that bring it out, they thrive in turmoil and public confusion. So for me, it's a bit of a case of trying to be like, okay, this is really bad and this is really sad, because a lot of people's lives were lost, regardless if you want a lockdown or not. However, there's a game being played here for which we are the pawns, and our stake in the conversation is quite low. I don't think it's something we should really be wasting our time arguing about, although it is a very painful thing should it be true. We have to be clear about what's going on here. None of this is for our benefit. The comment and the leakage, I
Yeah.
don't see it.
I agree. I agree, and I think it's obviously very insensitive. Folks have been sharing on Twitter that it's not bodies piling high. You're talking about individual people, individual
Exactly.
lives. All these numbers
Families.
all these people have stories. It's
Hmm.
interesting when you read the stats and you see 214,000 dead. You think it's a number. It's individual people, individual stories, and so folks were quick to remind or to whoever said this statement, whether it's the prime minister or otherwise,
Yeah.
the truth about COVID deaths. Now, there's also been anti-lockdown protests, haven't there, Basayo?
There
And
have
again,
been.
I'll yield to you for that.
You know what? It's so funny. I think I was going to one on Saturday, and someone was like, "Oh, I'm running late because I think there's protests." I was thinking, "Stop lying! What kind of excuse is that? They haven't been having protests for time. Like, what are people protesting about, right?" But then, lo and behold, got home and there were protests. So on Saturday, I think a lot of things happened on Saturday. 8 police officers were injured after violence broke out at an anti-lockdown protest in central London. The protest allegedly was about just generally, people who are against the lockdown and never really believed in it or feel like there's an ulterior motive. And again, with the addition of possibility of there being COVID passports, people were really outside, making themselves known. And I think two candidates for the mayor elections were there actually as well. Bottles were thrown apparently at police officers, and all took place in the infamous Hyde Park, and 5 people were arrested for the offences. So yeah, and they say 2 police officers were taken to hospital, but not for serious injuries, but all injuries to whoever you talk to are serious, I guess. And they say, and so yeah, I think with this one, a lot of speculation or a lot of conversation has been about why are people still protesting when as Michael said, June 21st is on the horizon and outside is opening slightly. So what exactly are you angry about? I thought maybe it
We're
was a
weeks
big.
away.
I thought it was a big finale. I thought it was like, okay, maybe it's a big finale. We've protested and let's just get a last hurrah so we can act like to say this is what led to June 21st. But again, as people said, there's a possibility of COVID passports. And I think there was something today that I saw about the government was contracting or looking for contract COVID marshals, which they basically said will be in place from July of this year to next year, but the details of what they'll be doing haven't really been addressed yet, and people speculate that it will probably be about maintaining social distancing and health and safety guidance. And some people have argued that actually, well, if June 21st is supposed to be, restriction free, then why do you need this? And again, then they're saying it's conspiracy that actually we're never going to end, we're going to stay in this for a long time. From one hand, I'm like, well, June 21st is not going to be the end of COVID-19, right? So people will still protest. There'll still be things to protest against. But at the same time, we have to think about what is the new climate going to look like? And this is where the protests make sense, where it's actually, if we are going to loosen up or we're going to have more restrictions, what does it look like? And does it impede on our liberal, our rights, as Michael and I think Aaron said last time?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I agree with that assessment. I think the public mood has changed quite a bit in that I don't think anti-lockdown people are now loonies on the right anymore. I think a lot of people could not stomach another national lockdown, especially when you look at what's been happening, maybe not internationally, but at least domestically within the UK. As Aaron's saying, as Richard was saying, we just saw a comment coming from Richard saying, do we need to wear masks? I think people are even, contending whether that's even something we need to do anymore, based on the numbers we've seen. We've been told that the numbers have been massaged, that up to 20% of folks who've died from COVID, didn't actually die from COVID, died with COVID. So the numbers are inflated. Passing and transmission, but also, hospitalizations amongst people under 30 it's pretty much non-existent. And so when you see someone like Joe Rogan, who this week got in some fire because he told he's legions of followers. I mean, Joe Rogan gets millions of views on everything he says. And he told them that if a young person asked him, should they take the vaccine, he would say no. Because if you're fit and healthy, it's okay. And essentially, he's speaking to this idea that this crisis, as it were, may have been greatly overplayed. And as such, get the vaccine because it's pretty much safe. But he wouldn't advise young people to get it. He came under lots of flack. The people were almost unified in calling that a stupid thing to say. But no doubt the debate will keep on raging. And who knows, if we have to go into another national lockdown, maybe I'll join the protest. But sorry, will you join me?
I don't think I would. I'm sorry. I've said
But
this.
you don't like protesting, do you?
No. I'm here for good. I've been on a few protests. Trust me, but
Oh,
I've been on a few protests. But I think with this one, it's the case of I don't feel as though I understand the conversation. Do you know what I'm saying?
yeah,
I understand it. And it's not that I don't understand why. And I said, it's not like I don't understand why people are protesting against it. I understand definitely from
yeah.
mental health reasons, from even the concept of how the government have handled it and people's own personal issues with, ulterior motives. I totally understand that. However, there have people that have died from
Yeah.
whichever you think this is, and therefore I wouldn't feel comfortable saying no lockdown without an alternative. Should I have an alternative to lockdown? I probably will protest and say, you know what, we don't need to do it like this, we need to do it this way. But I think the conversation that we're missing is what is the alternative? And some people might have that, and I understand it. But I think we have to be careful about saying, if I'm not necessarily for it, doesn't mean I'm against it. I agree with people's ideas of protest. However, I think realistically, if you don't come with something else, then I don't really understand what we're doing here. No vaccine, no lockdown, but then what? I don't know.
Okay. Fair points. Fair points. Folks, we are about to start our debate, our discussion. We've got some amazing guests from the States and also here in the UK domestically, so we can get a real panoramic view of the debate. And so this is your chance to share the stream with somebody. If you care about this topic, we're going to be talking about the gender pay gap. I should probably put gender in quotation marks, because that's what we're going to be debating. Does it exist the way we talk about it? But also, if it does exist, how do we fix the gender pay gap? So this is your time. Share the stream. Tweet maybe your preliminary thoughts on Twitter using the hashtag #CommonSenseLive. Of course, comment down your thoughts as well. We want to engage as much as possible. For those who are wondering, the point of this show is to get different perspectives in one room and to really have a good, respectable conversation with people who think different thoughts. So we want to make it very clear that you may, hear an idea you disagree with, but the whole essence of this show is that you spend a nice 30, 40 minutes in the evening considering some interesting ideas of people who may not see eye to eye with you. So we should probably start with some ground rules, which means explaining what the gender pay gap is, or at least the way people popularly use it. And the gender pay gap is basically calculated as the difference between the average hourly earnings, excluding overtime, of men and women as a proportion, of men and women as a proportion of men's average hourly earnings, right? Again, excluding overtime. And it's measured across all jobs in the UK. And it's not necessarily just the difference between men and women doing the same jobs. The reason why this is interesting for us to discuss is because one of the things COVID's done is obviously affected, how men and women relate and work together. We all lost jobs, lots of different things happened. So a lot of economists actually, I was about to say prophesied, but that's church speak. They forecasted that the gender pay gap should shrink during COVID. And so we want to take a look. Has things changed? What's COVID done to average hourly earnings of men and women? And essentially, how do we fix this gender pay gap? Of course, there's folks who don't think there is a gender pay gap in the way it's constituted. And that's to say that they don't think the gap that exists between men and women in terms of hourly earnings is solely because of gender. Or it's because, but gender is part of what a multivariate analysis might yield as to why there's a gap, so to speak. We'll get into all the detail in a minute. But before we bring on our first guest and all the subsequent ones, Basayo, shortly, what are your thoughts on the gender pay gap more generally?
I think the gender pay gap has been a persistent thorn in the I don't know if I say asses of women in this country.
You're right. You're just an American reference.
No, those words across the world. I think it's something that is really jarring and annoying. However, I definitely understand there are many different factors at play, both voluntary and involuntary. Most of it is socialization, which has been characterized as some sort of scientific reason as to why women haven't been around rather than the greater patriarchal system. But again, choices available to people are subject to and kind of allude to the roles that people feel like people have access to, as well as people's perceptions of what is open to them. So it's kind of a balance between that. And so once I guess the government or any institution kind of, eat away at the kind of social issues, then we can talk about choice. And I think that's where we're at. Yeah. So yeah.
Got you. I totally understand what you're saying. Just to kind of again put it out there. That is, of course, the first thing, is whether it's a fact that there is a gap between men and women because of gender, or whether it's a myth. To put my cards on the table, I'm of the opinion that, if you look at all the data, there definitely is a difference between what men earn and what women earn on a mean basis, on an average basis. However, to put that down solely to be because they're women and they're men is a slightly different thing. Just like if you calculated what 5'4" people earn versus what 6'9" people earn, and there's a difference, to say that's now because of their height, it's like, hold on, it's probably because of choices they're making, the way society is structured, the choice, where society places value and where it doesn't place value. So there's all these different things that may be the case. And the reason why I get that granular, even at this introductory stage, is because if we're going to change and actually fix things, we have to get very specific about what we're trying to fix. So to say there's this four-squad patriarchy that's just punching women down, well, how do we fix the patriarchy? Some women will say, get rid of all men, which obviously isn't sensible. But then the question is, how do we actually do things? And so we want to get there as well. Let's start perhaps in the UK with Mel. Mel is a tech writer at the Common Sense Network. She also works in tech. Mel, what are your thoughts on the gender pay gap?
Hey, yeah, well, I think it's still definitely very obvious, especially in tech. And it's very sad because obviously there's so much work being done to include women in tech. However, women at a senior level are still dramatically underpaid in tech compared to men. This disproportionately affects Black women, women from minority backgrounds who even find it hard to struggle to get into tech. So unfortunately, there is very much a gap. And I think it's very sad because there is a lot of work and there is a lot of inclusion being done, but on a senior level and on the organizational structure, as you said, Mike, that the way society is structured does not allow for women to have an easy access into any of these industries. Unfortunately, the high-paying ones like law and technology. But yeah, so as long as companies, big companies are not taking up the mantle and making sure that they do have this inclusion right at senior level, then we're going to be in the same situation years down the road, and that's very unfortunate.
Got you. I love that introductory remark. We're going to press into some of the stuff you said in a couple of minutes. I'm going to go straight to Jalen, who is in America. Jalen is a recent contributor here. He is a researcher based in America, recently graduated from university. And of course, things may be different in America. Quite a few things are different in America. So Jalen, join us from, let us know where you're joining us from. What are your thoughts on this gap, this gender pay gap?
So first of all, thank you for having me. My name is Jalen. As I said before, I'm from New Jersey, and I'm definitely excited to contribute to this conversation. In terms of my thoughts on the gender pay gap, I definitely think it exists. I think that, as with any statistic, there's a lot of nuance to it, in that, like, I think Asian men and Asian women get paid differently, white men, white women, black men, black women. I think there's a lot of nuance when we have those conversations, also depending on where you are, what industry you're in. Like, I don't think it's, to Mike's earlier point, I don't necessarily know if it's as cut and dry as men make more than women, even though to an extent, I kind of do think it is that cut and dry, but I just think there's a lot of nuance to it. And I am excited to dive into that topic with you guys.
Love it. And I'm going to bring on our last guest before Basiah starts prodding everybody and getting into the meat of what you guys are talking about. Aaron, we're going back to the UK. What are your thoughts?
Evening, guys. Hope you guys are well. Like Jalen said, I think there's a lot of nuance to this. As a general rule, though, I would say the gender pay gap exists, but it's not solely down to sexism when we live in one of the most egalitarian societies in the world. I've actually got a statistic here. This is by a study done by the UK Parliament. It says that the gender pay gap for all employees is larger than full-time or part-time pay gaps. And this is because a much higher share of women than men that are employed part-time, and part-time workers tend to earn less per hour than those working full-time. This is further backed up by This is further backed up by the pay gap factors affecting women's employment and earning opportunities become more evident when women are in their late 30s and early 40s. There's a huge gap between a woman who's in her late teens, early 20s, and a woman who's in her 40s. Reason why usually is because a lot of them spend time outside the labor market to care for children or elderly relatives. So when you consider that, if they're more likely to take time out of the labor market to care for things, and they're more likely to earn less money over time because they're more likely to work part-time, the gender pay gap kind of explains itself. But the idea that I think that, for example, for every pound a man earns, a woman gets paid 79 pence, I'm not quite sure I agree with that totally.
I have heard that said, and I do think it is a bit misleading, if I'm honest. And obviously, I'm open for people to disagree with me, because that's when people say for every time a man earns a pound, a woman gets this amount. It's like who's paying her?
It doesn't make sense. Like the way I feel,
like that's not quite how it's happening. It's not that there's an unscrupulous boss.
Like if I was a businessman,
hold on 1 minute, Aaron. It's not just that there's an unscrupulous boss that's just saying, I'm going to give men £1 and women 75p. There are some that do that, and that's illegal. So there's really no discussion to have there other than they need to be prosecuted. But the notion that it's just one person doing that and it's not actual individual choices by people that creates that reality, that's a problem. We can obviously go into detail about why those choices, women are making these choices, and why society is set up in a certain way. But I think it's a bit unfair to when people just use that stat unbacked up without much context. I think it does more to pollute the conversation. Sorry.
I mean, I'm thinking to myself, to put it crudely, right? I'm going big again. Sorry. To put it crudely, if I was a businessman and I knew that I could get away with paying a woman 3/4 of what I would pay a man for the same price, I would never hire a man again. From a business standpoint, if I knew I could get away with that. But like I said, there are lots of generational differences. For example, younger workers may have higher levels of education on average and may be more likely to work in certain higher paying industries than our parents. Like, for example, from the Caribbean community, a lot of us tend to be like public servants, a lot of them like working class and stuff. Whereas more people in more like the African diaspora, they're more likely to go on to be like teachers and doctors and lawyers. And you compare the average salary of a lawyer to say, I don't know, an admin or receptionist, for example. You compare the salaries there. And then you have the female pay gap with them more likely to take time out of work and stuff like that. Yeah. So there's lots of nuances to this. It's not a yes or no answer, but it's not as simple as just saying I earn £1 as a man and a woman earns 79 pence as a woman. I'm not really sure I buy into that idea totally. There's a lot of nuance to it. But yeah.
I would love to pitch in something to that idea, though. I do think that it is important that we recognize the nuance in this conversation. At the same time, I do think it's important that we acknowledge the validity in the statement. I think that sometimes in debates, so like I'm from America, as you stated before, I think sometimes in debates, we get so caught up in disagreeing with the point that we don't really take the essence of what's being said, right? And like, it might not be 79 cents exactly. It might not be that men are intentionally like doing these things to women. But I do think that when we're having conversations about the pay gap, it's important to come from a perspective of acknowledgement, just from my perspective, you know? Like, I do believe that women are treated differently than men. That being said, I do conceivably, like, I can conceive how women are across the board paid less than men. Like, I don't think that's an inconceivable thing from my experience and from my conversations with women. And I think as like men, it's important to kind of acknowledge that as well as we kind of debate the merits of the conversation itself.
Would love to hear from Basayo or Mel. What are your thoughts on this, folks?
I just wanted to say that, like, I know we'll get into this, but ultimately, when we look at systems, we all know that like overarching systems generally benefit certain types of people, but doesn't mean everyone in that system is going to benefit. So we don't have to say, do you know what I mean, some men earn less for it to disprove that the patriarchy is at work. But also, again, when we look at choices, this is why I want to say you have to kind of disaggregate where the choice comes in and what other things are predicted on that person. Because even if you think about choices women are making, those choices are influenced by society as well, or what she thinks is available to her. So even if the choice at first hand looks like they want to leave the workforce to have children, or they are pursuing part-time roles, yes, on the scale, it looks like, say, they're choosing certain roles will make them pay less. But why are those options available to them in that way, or why are they choosing those options? So for you, you have to figure out actually where does that choice actually start as a choice. No one's saying it's not a choice, but really and truly, if you're a young girl in school, for example, or secondary school, there are certain ways you're socialized or certain things that you believe you can achieve or can't achieve, whether it's real or not, that will affect the choices you make. So to the individual, because there isn't, I guess, a gun by your head, they will articulate it as a choice. But realistically, what you're socialized to believe is accessible to you is then it kind of skews, actually, is it a choice, or is it society? Because if there's part-time jobs, why aren't more men taking up part-time jobs then? Because they're also available to them. So we have to look at it on the flip side as well and have that conversation, rather than just look at it in terms of saying there doesn't have to be a big man. And I think sometimes when we have this conversation, sometimes men or people who are against this conversation look at blame. And the quickness to defend yourself and go, but no one's doing that, doesn't take away the fact that it's happening. And we can all admit that it's societal, whether women are inflicted on themselves or whether men are. As a society, this is the case. And we can place the blame where we want to place the blame, but that shouldn't stop you from accepting the fact that women are paid less or treated differently in the workforce.
Yeah, I think what I would say to that is, I don't think it's necessarily about accepting the facts as much as how do we fix things, so to speak. So it's not even about apportioning blame, I don't think, at least from my perspective, because the blame is irrelevant. It doesn't really matter who's to blame. The question is, how do we solve the gap? And I think if we're going to solve it, first is identifying what it is we're saying. So someone saying that for every pound a man earns, a woman earns, 79p, right? That statement and what that's connoting and meaning is very different to you saying that society is set up in such a way such that women are choosing part-time work more than men, and for that reason, that's translating into them being paid less. Because one is, who's paying a woman to 79p less every time, and how do we find them?
No, but you're asking who's paying. You're asking who's paying, and this is what I'm saying is that
if you say that statement alone, that's what it connotes, that someone is being unscrupulous, right? Which may very well be the case. But my point is, the first thing we have to do is really clarify exactly what we're trying to fix, so to speak. So for instance, are we trying to get to a position where for every pound, if we look at the average hourly earnings of men and women across the whole country, it's the same? Is that the position we're trying to get to, right? Are we trying to say, because the reason why I think it's been persistent, and to give some facts to this, but between 2019 and 2020, the gap amongst all employees went down from 17.4%, right, to 15.5%. When it comes to full-time employees, the gap is less, right? So it went down to 7.4%.
Sorry, what year is this? Is this for last year?
This is from 2019 to 2020.
For COVID. So we have to be careful about when we're taking these facts as well. I understand the pattern, but you have to look at COVID increased the amount of part-time work available for many people as well. So this is what I'm saying. I get the pattern, but the context we're using is a unique time.
Yeah, of course. But COVID affected men and women. It wasn't that women were unduly there's nothing in COVID that was particular for men.
It didn't affect them equally. But that's fine.
I know it didn't.
I would agree.
But my point is, COVID cut across, everybody, so to speak. Folks, it was really about it. COVID, I think, affected industries more than it did individual people. I think certain industries just shut down. If you're in the airline industry, or you're in events, as it were, if you were in school, whatever it was, you were affected differently from if you were working a 0-hour contract or whatever it was. The point to make, though, just so we're clear, is I'm saying the reason why we're asking now specifically what we're trying to solve is so that the solutions we come up with are better. Because a solution about empowering women to choose better jobs is very different from saying we need to ensure that maternity leave, right, is properly compensated, quote unquote, or available to men as well. So stretching the realm of paternity leave. There's lots of different policy solutions, but if we can't define the problem clearly, I think we'll just keep kind of chucking different solutions at it, and unfortunately, they won't actually fix the problem at hand. Go on, hey, Aaron. I see your hand up.
I was just going to make a point. I was slightly confused what Basai was saying, because the way I see it, if we're talking about socialization, if we're basically saying that society is to blame for choices that women make, then it's almost as if we're saying that women are not capable of making their own choices in their own right. Some women, it's almost as if we're saying that it's almost wrong for a woman to want to be a stay-at-home mum or be a mum and work part-time. We're talking as if these things are a bad thing, because this is the problem that I have with, respectfully, modern-day feminism. It tells you can do everything that you want and to be equal as men, apart from being a mother, for example. Some women actually like that lifestyle where they want to work part-time and, stay-at-home mum or housewife and take care of the kids. What's wrong with that? Why is society wrong for doing that? What is wrong with being feminine in and of itself?
Aaron,
there's lots of nuances to this.
Let me just clarify. I never said society was wrong. I said when we place where the issues, another issue might come from, is how society sees things. How society sees things. Society is amoral. It's not good or bad. It just is what it is, right? Just like history is amoral. It just is what it is. So the point is, I wasn't saying that being a stay-at-home mom or choosing that is wrong or bad. But I'll say on the flip side, the conversation about being a stay-at-home dad isn't given the same weight. So when you talk about stay-at-home mum, it's not opened only to women. So again, the data that's accessible to women should be accessible to men. When we talk about maternity, because you're talking about choices, and then you're also actually giving value to what I'm saying by saying a woman would want to be a stay-at-home mom, but you're not also saying a dad would want to be a stay-at-home dad. So why are we having that conversation about a woman's choice rather than a man's choice? But just one more thing.
Men are several times, sorry to interrupt, men are several times less likely to be a stay-at-home mother, because some people would argue that women are better at being parents than men are.
Exactly. So where's that coming from? But you just said people. I don't want to argue this point too much, but you just made the point you said people, and I'm assuming people society, right? So again, we go back to the same point, is that the influencer factors is that people have said, or there might be options. I wouldn't talk for all men, I don't know, but maybe between you and maybe other male friends might figure out how likely is it that people have encouraged you to be a stay-at-home father as a formidable career path or something that you would do, versus a woman who would actually on her own, or whether society might say, actually, I'm going to stay outside the workforce. But that's not, we're saying that's amoral. We're not saying it's wrong or right. We're just saying that's a point. But in terms of maternity leave and maternity pay is a connected conversation, but it's not the same conversation entirely. But compensating a woman for days she's not working, carrying a child is different to what we're talking about is pay, but it's also linked depending on how you aggregate the data. So again, we shouldn't just.
That's one of the biggest reasons, though, Basaya. I hope you know that one of the biggest reasons for the gap, as it were, is because of childcare.
So the point, exactly, childcare is different.
If you solve that, but my point is just that the whole idea of women having children, right? Whether it's that they go out the workforce and they have to come back and negotiate their way up, and by the time they come back, the men have already moved ahead. Whether it's that they're not compensated properly, whether it's that childcare is expensive, the whole business of having children is one of the biggest reasons why there is a gap. So whatever the conversations are, how do we address that?
100%. But I get what your point is. I think we all want the same point, but I think we shouldn't hide behind the fact that we can say that society has been this unfair to women in that sense. We can call it that. Some people call it the patriarchy, and some people call it choices, whichever it is. But if we're not honest about how that came about, and we can remove blame, then even finding solutions to that, it would be quite disingenuous. How do you find solutions to something that you don't really understand how we got there? So when we talk about child responsibilities again, why did it fall to the women? Why did women incur the cost and not men? So this is why we have to talk about.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think everything you're saying, there's research and conversations about. You know, a lot of people would argue that, and Jaden, I know you're about to speak, so feel free to jump in after. A lot of people would argue that in the first few months of a child's life, the mother is way more useful than the man, right? Just way more useful in terms of being kind of connected to the child, in terms of feeding, all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying folks might make that argument. That might be the reason, and if you're going to go through a religious standpoint, whatever you want to call it, that gears up, you know, mothers and females to be the primary caregivers within the kind of the first few years of a baby's life. Whether that's right or wrong is another question, right? But that's the way things are currently constituted now. If we're saying that we need to change that, and we need to say women should not be the primary caregivers in the first few years of a child's life, it should be equal and go that way, then we're talking here about societal change, as it were. And for me, as I see it, there's a crazy amount of time lag attached to that. It's going to take a while for us to get to a stage where society goes, you know what, mothers and fathers, you know, within the first few years, first few months of a baby's life, doesn't matter. Anyone can do it. You know, whatever. A woman can get straight back to work. Consider the fact that some women, if they give birth, based on the process of through which they gave birth, some of them are out anyways by virtue of just not being able to work, a sickness, complications. There's a lot of stuff that goes into the business of childbearing. Hence why I'm saying that's probably one of the biggest differentiators in the aggregate number we get at the top. But go ahead, Jalen.
I think one of the things that we've kind of all agreed on to an extent is the role of women as like caregivers in like our society more generally. I think that being said, when we talk about solutions, I think that countries and nations should have serious conversations about what work means. I think that women give at least they give a lot of hours in unpaid labor caring for the home, caring for children, doing all these very, very important things to a society, but they're not paid for it, right? And I think that if we really do want to discuss closing the wage gap and we acknowledge that women being caregivers might be an extent of that, like might be contributing to that, I think it's important for us to ask, should mothers get paid or should parents get paid for caregiving? Like, people are spending so much labor, literal labor, investing in their kids, and they're not getting paid for it, and women are getting the short end of the stick. I think one solution would be maybe considering paying them for that work. And then secondly, I think another thing, just from a corporate standpoint, from a economic standpoint, I think wage transparency is huge. I think one of the biggest reasons gender pay gaps or any type of pay gaps persist in our society is because companies aren't transparent about wages. If you don't know what your colleague is making, you're not going to ask for a higher wage. So I think a lot of that is perpetuated by a lack of transparency. And I think that, I think considering paying people for their child rearing labor and salary transparency can go a long way to helping to close the gap.
Mel, no, I don't, let's just say for Mel, because I know Mel, you spoke about how at the senior level there's a lot of disparity, isn't there, in tech.
Yeah, I just want to jump on what Jalen said. It comes back to company culture. So a lot of companies actually do have equal paternity and maternity leave for men and women, but oftentimes women don't feel empowered, as Jalen said, to kind of push for promotions at work and insist on wage transparency. And as so much of what Busayo said was completely spot on when it comes to women's role of caregiving, that also applies to elderly parents as well as children. And it's often our society makes it harder for men to admit that they would like to be a caregiver, that they would love to be a teacher, work with children. They don't feel empowered to even sort of admit that the same way women do. And all of that systemically leads to inequality in wages that we are still seeing. So, yeah.
Totally. Go on, Aaron.
I mean, the idea of paying the tax, I mean, when we talk about paying women for childcare, I mean, first of all, who are you working for? Are you working for... When you look after your own child, who are you working for? A company, the state, a private company? Who are you working for as a principal? And second of all, should the taxpayer be forced to foot the bill for a child that you chose to have? Children cost money, and as it is, and you have to ensure as individuals that you have to have the economic stability to raise this child. I don't understand why the taxpayer should be responsible for children. Otherwise, everyone will be doing it. There'll be no. Where would the limit go? How many children should a person be allowed to have if we get cut off? Those kind of things.
You remember, one minute, Jalen, just to add a bit of context to that, and also something for us to bear in mind is in the UK, we did have a situation not too long ago. You remember those films on Channel 4, Benefit Street, this idea, you know, if you give the amount of children you have, you get a certain stipend payment from the state. Yeah. And essentially that leading to people abusing the process almost, you know, having children so they could get that continual contribution. So that's something probably to bear in mind. But sorry, go ahead, Jalen.
I don't want to be misunderstood with my children point. So I'm going to get back to that. But the first thing I was going to say, I think when you ask who are parents working for, I think that there is an argument to be made that parents in raising their children are working in the best interest of the state. And I do think that as a country, you can argue that paying people for their labor in raising their children can be a net benefit. I'm sure there's like economic data that might support that. And then as a follow-up to just clarify my point, I do not necessarily think people should get, well, in America, we get tax credits for children. But I don't think what I was proposing is that mothers or fathers should get paid per child. What I think they should get paid for the labor they are putting into raising that child. No, and I think those are two different things.
No, but it's the same point. It's the idea that you are looking after your child, whether you think you're working for the state or working for yourself. The idea that you should basically be getting paid for having responsibility for your own child. Why should a person be paid for taking responsibility for a child they chose to have? This is the
because not paying them hasn't been working. I said because not paying them hasn't been working, and we're talking about the wage gap.
I don't really think people should be having kids they can't really afford it like that. I don't think so. You have to be. This is where it comes down to the individual, because the argument there's like you made a point earlier about how kids in the state and stuff. I don't really think it's healthy to have this idea that parents are raising their kids for the state. Not everything revolves around the state. What about raising them as individuals in their own right? Are we raising these kids to be public servants specifically? Are we saying that, for example, a child
I think you're right on one thing, Aaron, which is another point of clarification to put there as well is that women don't have children by themselves. It's households that have children, right? It's two people that have children. So the notion that women have children, women get paid, I'm not quite sure how that would kind of reduce the gender pay gap. It would go away so as to incentivize maybe having children, or to even show society we value it more. But one of the reasons why I think this gender pay gap, as we're calling it, might be such a stain that persists is because even when we look at a composition level of how we get to these numbers, the people say stuff like that and they feel like society pays women less. And it's like, that's obviously a very okay thing to feel. But of course, if we're going to solve it, we definitely have to have the data, because we have to know when we're moving in the right direction, and we need to know when we're moving in the wrong direction. As it pertains to the numbers we have right now, it's not that most men are doing well. It's that a very small proportion of really highly paid men skew the numbers for everybody else. So much so that when we look at the data again, when we consider people under the age of 30, the gender pay gap is pretty much non-existent for people who are low paid. Like it just doesn't exist really, because at that stage, your introductory jobs, everyone gets the same. It's when you get higher, and one of the biggest predictors of how much you're going to earn is age. I think we all know that. The older someone is, the more time they've had to accumulate money and wealth. And so when you look at the footballers, you look at the people in entertainment, you look at the people who are high up in banking, who are in the tech sector, those small number of men who are highly paid, they're the ones who are skewing things, right? So the question becomes, with understanding that nuance, how then do our policy proposals change, right? Because the issue here, I don't think, is with most kind of the medium kind of quintile of men. It's the upper quintile that are really skewing things.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think in terms of, that's why we have to disaggregate it, right, and find good samples. A lot of the data we have isn't about the whole of the UK. It's actually based on sample sizes on certain people. So we are also, our information is even limited by the data we have. But I wanted to move to something that Jalen was saying in terms of paying people, in terms of that wouldn't solve things. But again, the gender pay gap is solving that is a means of itself, but it's also part of a bigger conversation as well. But it's got an ending, which is also the propensity to enter poverty. So it's not just about your ability to enter wealth, it's also about your propensity to enter poverty. And when we look at those figures, women are more likely to enter poverty than men are. So you can try and fix it by looking forward, but you also have to try and fix it by looking back as well. And when you look at looking back, you'll see that actually this conversation isn't just about how do we make women high earners, and therefore how to live a fulfilled life isn't just about how much money you earn. But we know that resources must go to increasing your quality of life. So we might get to a place where we can have an honest conversation about actually this data, with obvious slight improvements in places that we all agree on, isn't as bad, because actually those earning less, they still have access to good schooling, they still live long, they still have XYZ and certain choices they're making, which it's more of a choice. But we haven't got the privilege to have such a discussion yet. And so we have to be careful that while we're not looking at the glamorous, as you said, the glamorous lifestyles that look like, oh, why are we not accessing that? That's not what people are even aiming for. Most people aren't looking at how do we get more people to be millionaires, but preventing them from entering poverty. So I think that's just something we have to look at. And there's one last thing I want to say is that there's a book called Invisible Women, and it looks about the data bias in this world. And again, that contributes to the economy, because when you look at how cities are designed, right, and housing is designed, it actually does disadvantage a lot of women, because of even the route to get to work sometimes is designed around like a middle class man who goes to the city and routes that go past him. When you look at routes to go to schools and things like that will affect women's journeys and the price of that journey, it accumulates over time. So we have to look at actually the wages themselves, they're not based on productivity. So we're having a conversation about things that, how do we even create wages? There'll be a platform that goes, okay, this is what we think you're contributing skill-wise. But a lot of it is to do with the reputation the society gives it, right? So how are we then saying, how do you apply that? So even the wages as a metric, we have to disaggregate that and say, actually, why are people being paid what they're being paid anyway?
Do you think it's more to do with, with market demand as well? Like, for example, you look at, for example, footballers and how they're in like billion-pound industries and players are getting stupid money, like 200-300 grand a week. Because, like, for example, there's more of a demand for entertainment than there is for health nowadays.
But why? But are female footballers women footballers being paid less than men playing football?
Yes, and the reason why is because like, okay, I'll give you a stat, right? I read it was a stat by the Daily Wire, and it said basically that if you compare the gross income between the Women's World Cup in 2019 and the Men's World Cup in 2018, the Men's World Cup generated just over 13 times more gross income than the women's income. Why is that? Because men as a whole, respectfully, as a whole, men are bigger, taller, stronger, faster than women, and therefore can play sports at a higher and more intense level. There are probably more women who watch men's football than women's football. So there's that.
So when we look at that, and again, that is a plausible conversation that we can have. But when you look at the investment into it, looking at the outcome of it is one thing. But the point is, what I'm trying to tell you, the story isn't.
It's a chicken or the egg thing, isn't it?
That's what I'm trying to say. So I'm trying to say, I understand your point, but the investment you put in, when we look at even the European Super League and that conversation, how they weren't really clear about how that would benefit the women's team. We can have a conversation about actually, yes, of course, it generates more money, but then generating more money comes from also potentially the investment. But why are people investing in these people? Again, society has decided that being stronger in football, when it's actually quite an agile skill set sport, more so than actually a weight sport. Pardon?
Have you seen, like, for example, if you were to put up, say, a big bad man defender like Virgil van Dijk or Nemanja Vidic, against what's her name? What's that woman in America? The one, the lesbian woman with the blue hair, Megan Rinnepo, whatever her name is, Megan something. You know what I'm talking about, innit? Put Van Dijk up against Vidic and see what happens. Van Dijk is 6'4". Megan is something like 5'8" or something.
So you watch football to see. So you watch football to see. You watch football to see 6+ foot men playing. Because I would question how many men above 6 foot who are big and wham are actually playing in the Premier League versus the. I wouldn't understand, but I get your point in that sport. But then if we replicate that across other fields where women will maybe biologically or technically or socially could be doing better, how does that skew things as well? So we have to just. I'm just trying to say, I get your point, and your point isn't wrong. There is a market demand for it, but markets come from somewhere. Market isn't magic. It comes from people's attitudes and what the value you place on it. So we just have to remember that.
There's a line that has to be drawn. There's biology involved in here as well. That's it.
But biology doesn't give you money. You then decide that biology is worth money. It doesn't. It doesn't, because you have to decide.
If we just hear each other make points and we try to be succinct, we can actually fit both of you in. So Aaron, go ahead. What was your response to what Basaya just said?
I'm saying, so from what I understand, if I'm interpreting this wrong, please correct me. From what I understand is basically we're saying that it's biology is not the only factor when it comes to attitudes about sports. Like, they're probably, like, I don't really watch tennis, right? But I only know that the brand names like Serena Williams and what's the sister name? Jupiter? No, Venus. That's it. Yeah, and a couple.
Did you do that on purpose?
No, I didn't. I actually no idea. I don't really like. That's it. But I know.
Got you. But make your point, because we're running out of time. So make your point.
The point is simple. I'm talking about sports as the industry, just specifically. There's nuances to this, like I said. But with sports, it's like people are more likely going to watch sports that are more intense. And the intensity from sports, depending on what it is, in this case football, comes from lots of things: speed, strength, stamina, etc. And men, at the general point, men have it better. And that's why.
Basaya, Basaya, you were replying to that.
Yeah, so my point is that I don't dispute that there's an element of that people might preference, they might want to see that, but then women aren't playing men in these sports, they're playing each other. And so you can actually see that skill and see that technicality and then see the entertainment when you watch women play other women as well. That doesn't mean that it isn't a biological preference for certain sports, and I get that. However, I'm just trying to say, can you really prove to the extent of the differences as well? We're not just about differences, from what the extent of it, that there isn't a lot to do with how society places value on that and the way capitalism drives that as well.
Yeah.
You're not really fed your ideas. How do you know where your ideas start from if it isn't the fact that you were just groomed in that way to be like, actually, I prefer to watch male sports because that's the dominating sports. I see it every day on BBC One or Sky News. I don't see women on that for me to develop the appetite. That's all I'm saying. But I hear your point.
How much do you bring that society?
Hold on 1 minute, Aaron. I just want to hear from Jalen because I know, Jalen, you were going to speak earlier. Go ahead.
My point is kind of null and void now. I was just gonna say, like, when we were having the conversation about soccer and how women soccer players are played less than male soccer players, and how it comes down to a demand thing. I think that, like almost everything, like it's a lot more nuanced than that. Male athletes are not making more money than women strictly because of demand. They're making more money because their organizations are deciding to give a certain percentage of their income to their athletes, in the same way that Amazon decides to give a percentage of its income to its employees. Like, it's not as simple as more people want to see male basketball players. Like, companies are making decisions to pay these people a certain amount. I do agree that demand goes into how much revenue a company may make, but I think that's only one piece of it, because at the end of the day, companies are getting that revenue and then making decisions on how do you spend it, I guess is the best way to say it. Like, those are decisions that are made. They're, it's not just the demand.
And this is probably another point of nuance to consider when we look at the aggregate gap as well, private sector versus public sector. Within the public sector, where the government has a lot of control and reins, and even then it's complicated, they can enforce some of these strategies, some of these policies, and make everything universal, make everything equitable. But unfortunately, when you add the private sector into there, so many different things come into play, like the choices that women make, we've said before, but also the culture in certain places. The fact that to be a top earner within you literally need to work 24/7. We all saw it a few weeks ago. Consultants, or I don't know whether it's graduate jobs or consultants at Goldman Sachs, posting their working conditions, and everyone was, we were all collectively gasping at just how crazy the kind of working hours were. And that's what's needed, right? A lot of these senior roles right now are not constituted for someone who wants to have a family and who wants to kind of, settle down, so to speak. It's constituted for people who are willing to be individuals, very flexible, available to work anytime. And on an aggregate level, more men right now are willing to do that than women are willing to do that. We have a way to go before we change preferences and we change even what we call a senior role. Women often speak about how they have to kind of take on male traits in order to be successful. It's a shame, because male traits are a predictor for success within the business world more than female traits are. We ought to change that, but again, it's like that has a time lag effect. Senior roles aren't designed for women at large. That's a problem. We need to change that. Care and responsibilities and part-time roles, unfortunately, are not shared equally. We need to change that. Women choosing low-paid jobs and sectors, we need to change that. There's a lot of things we need to change, but I just think for this conversation, what jars me, even as we round up, is one, how the conversation is often introduced. And I think, someone said before that patriarchy and choices, those are literally two opposed things. Patriarchy says there is a pathology and a superstructure of male domination. So that implies intent. It implies design, and it implies someone pushing things forward, so to speak. The other one, which is choices, that's a kind of a downstream thing. One's upstream, the other's downstream. That you change that through education and all these other things we've said. And here's the thing: if we give people free will and full freedom, the idea that they would all choose and everything be balanced is obviously not true. Because if people choose freely, who knows what the outcomes may be? So, and it's funny because when you look at Scandinavian countries where they've gone really far to try and equalize things, they're actually seeing the biggest differences in terms of choices that men and women are making, right? Because ultimately, to think that a solution is when everyone has freedom, and to think that freedom will mean we have a gender pay gap of 0, whatever it is, I also think is pretty naive. I don't think that might be the case. Because of time, I'm going to give us all a chance to wrap up and say that maybe literally a statement, what your closing remark is, and we're going to wrap up there. So we'll start with Aaron. What are you thinking?
I'm going to say, generally speaking, I'm not quite sure the gender pay gap as a whole, exists. Although I would say there are nuances, and as society becomes more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow instead of shrink. I don't think it's good to relegate the conversation to say men need to do less of this and women need to do more of this because #equality. I don't think that's a healthy conversation to have. But that's
got you. We'll end with with our two female contributors. So we'll have you go next, Jalen.
Definitely. I think my closing statement will kind of just be, when someone explains their oppression to you, you should listen. You shouldn't necessarily believe them. You don't necessarily have to agree, but I do think you should listen to what they're saying, because I think most oppressed people are not making up their oppression, just in like a general sense, as a Black American, as a Black person in the world. I think most people who feel oppressed they're not coming from nowhere. So that would be my closing statement.
Got you. And we'll go next to Mel and then.
Well, yeah, I guess I kind of made all my points, but just in general, when women are paid less than men for doing exactly the same job, which is definitely the case with COOs in tech who are women, then we know that there is more at play than simply just, I don't know, childcare and things like that. I think it is a cultural shift that needs to be had. I think, especially in certain industries, women need to be recognized what they do bring to the table. And especially when it comes to culture in workplaces, as has been touched on, we need to make sure we don't just hire people and promote people who are just like us and echo the traits of men, for example, or white men or whatever, because that's just holding everyone back. So, yeah.
Got you. And as we reflect on this conversation, Basayo, what is your thought?
I feel as though it's a good debate. I feel like it's really important for people to make arguments and back it up with facts, especially if they want to convince other people of your reality. So I definitely accept that, and I definitely accept that like choice, the outcomes of choices isn't necessarily going to look egalitarian. I think it's the right to have the choice rather than outcome of that choice. So we can't judge choice by the outcome, right? However, I feel like if you're not subject to, if you're not, as Jalen said, you're not oppressed by it, you have to also be careful that your lack of proximity to the issue doesn't allow the conversation to play out in a way where it, doesn't appease you. Sometimes you've got to let conversations play out in a way where it's actually doesn't affect me as much. So maybe I'm not going to look as hard as I need to or be as empathetic as I need to. Ultimately, all this comes down to is attitudes. And sometimes attitudes can get locked into institutions and locked into systems, and that's how easy it could be. Because even remarks made here when we joke, I know there've been many jokes, but if we joke about what's Venus's sister or Swingy's name is Jupiter, that's a joke, right? But it could give signals to people that those kind of jokes are okay. And when you see a woman beside you might want to hire her, you might be okay to treat her a certain way. It might not be in wages, but that's how it starts. And either it might affect her ability to navigate that space, or it might affect how you treat her. So we have to be careful that attitudes and remarks, and again, I'm not trying to say anyone here is doing that, but I'm saying that this is how small it starts. It starts by going, I think it's my preference. And then when you're so particular about your preferences and being like, then that's when we get to a place of like, there's no conversation because people feel attacked. So yeah.
To be fair, and I know Aaron forgot Venus's name. Aaron forgets everyone's name, so he's an equal offender. I could defend him on that front. But you're absolutely right in that it's a complex situation. I think is what we were saying, and it's nuanced. And I think if all we've done with this debate is invite people listening to be a bit more nuanced about the debate, then I think it's a win. Because one thing I don't like is when people kind of put a stat up and run away from it, not realizing that stat with that context conveys intent, and that intent isn't always what people think it is. And so if we're going to solve issues, we have to be able to name them. We cannot solve things we can't name. And so getting very specific about, where the problems are, what the issues are, will mean that we can create better solutions to solve them. Folks, thank you for listening to this debate. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least it informed you somewhat. And if it just annoyed you, we're sorry. Sorry about that. We think the route to a better world, as lofty as that sounds, is conversations with people who disagree. That's what we're all about, our common sense. So if you enjoyed this, then hit the subscribe button, turn your notification bell on. But also, this will be available on rebroadcast, so you can share this with a friend. You can, hopefully it starts debates and discussions amongst your groups. And if you want to join Common Sense, you're thinking, I like what these people are talking about, then go to join.tcsnetwork.co.uk. That's join.tcsnetwork.co.uk. And we will see you in the next debate.